Hello, everyone. I am Rick Becker, host of the Irish Baseball Podcast, joined today by Bill Barry, who wrote this book, The 1877 Railroad Strike in Baltimore. And we are going to talk about a lot of Irish immigrant and Irish American history today. Thanks for joining us, Bill.
Oh, glad to be here, Rick, and I'm hoping for the Guardians to go to the World Series this year.
Okay, that was not what I was expecting from somebody from Baltimore, but maybe we'll get into that
I
a little
understand.
later.
I'm from Cleveland. I'm loyal. Grew up going to the
Okay.
games.
So the 1877 railroad strike in Baltimore. I want to just talk about this a little bit and then we'll get into why this is specifically a piece of Irish American history. But what caused the 1877 railroad strike in Baltimore?
The greed of the B&O Railroad Company. And what had happened is we've seen a transformation of the United States since the War of Independence and large corporations. It became a national economy. And so the challenge was how do you move goods from one area to another? It used to be that you would have them in your own little neighborhood and people would buy them and come around. And you can see that, for example, at places like the Holland's Market, which is down near the Irish Railroad Workers Museum. But the challenge was now goods are going to be shipped all across the country. And initially, the idea was they're going to be shipped on canals. And the C&O Canal was built, and that was going to go from Albany out to the Midwest. People in this area said, "Oh, we can't do that. We're going to build another canal," and that became the C&O Canal, which is leaving out of D.C. But after the Independence War of Independence, people had invented this unusual device called a railroad, and so they started figuring out how much faster you could move commodities on a railroad. And at this point, the railroads were still driven by horse-drawn carriages. But the investors in Baltimore decided that they would try and build a rail line that would run from Baltimore to Ohio, which is how it got to be the name of the B&O. And they initially started with a route from Baltimore to Ellicott City, which is just south of Baltimore, about 15, 20 miles. And actually, there's a town now called Relay, which is halfway between Baltimore and Ellicott City. And it was originally Ellicott's Mills because it was the Ellicott family that built textile mills down there. And the goal was they're going to have to move that fabrics and on a large vehicle like a train. And there's a town halfway down called Relay, and it was called Relay because that was where they changed the team of horses. And it later became important during the strike when engineers took a rail car down to Relay and then just stopped and got off, and it basically blocked the rails. But one of the things that happened is building the railroads and running the railroads required huge amounts of labor, often unskilled, but labor which could then be trained as it was on the railroad. And so it became a magnet for Irish immigration. And at the time of the Great Hunger, a third of the country left Ireland and came here to the United States. And it's something that I always talk about when I have Irish friends who will object to immigration today. And I call it Irish amnesia because we forget that we're descendants of people who came from Ireland to this country. And my great grandfather came from Ireland and went to Cleveland, Ohio, and worked in the steel mill. And I am proud to have him as a relative. But so the railroads really grew. They became very profitable. They became huge corporations, and the Baltimore and Ohio became one of them. And what happens is when you have a change in the workforce, the workers start behaving differently. And so what we see in the early 1850s, 60s, certainly the railroads grew after the Civil War, but people started organizing unions. And they were originally benefit societies. That is, if you were hurt at work and working on the railroad was very dangerous. And there was a great expression, the brakemen, and the brakemen were the men who would go around turning the wheels on all the cars to make them stop. And there was an expression that there's nothing as rare as a brakeman with a full hand because you would get caught between the cars and lose fingers and parts of your hands. And so it became a issue in the unions to create a benefit fund. And they weren't bargaining with the employers, but they were saving money so that if someone got hurt at work, there was no such thing as workers' compensation. A judge had ruled that the railroads were liable for lost luggage, but not for anybody hurt on the job.
Oh,
It was a
geez.
kind of a dysfunction. No, it was a legal structure that was not sympathetic. So the union started doing these benefit funds and would provide temporary income if you couldn't work, and would provide death benefits for your family if you got hurt. And so the railroads started fighting this. Um, what they did was use then the panic of 1873 as an excuse to try and go after the unions. And so what we see then is that they started cutting the pay of the railroad workers starting in 1877. And the 10% here and 10% there. One of the things that they did in Baltimore was it used to be able to ride from Baltimore out to, say, Western Cumberland County, someplace like that. And then if your shift was over or your trip was over out there, you could then hop the next train coming back. John Garrett became the president of the B&O and said, we're going to stop this. This is welfare scheming in effect. And so that if you were in that area, you had to either pay your way back on a B&O train or you had to pay for overnight till you got your next train coming back. So it was all this incredible shifting. And it was incredibly difficult for the families in Baltimore. What we saw then in March of 1877 was an engineer strike on the Pennsylvania Railroad, a growth of activity. One of the things which was important here in Baltimore, and it's a sign of the times, was that there was also two other strikes, and they were strikes by can makers, for example. And these were guys in little shops of 5 and 6 people. It's the last of the small industry in comparison to the enormous power of the B&O. And the B&O was a huge corporation. It was funding lots of things. Johns Hopkins was involved in it. And when I do programs on the strike, I talk about how history is remembered because for many, many years, decades, the house of John W. Garrett, who was the chairman of the B&O, is maintained as a memorial. And it's a mansion with gold-plated uh, faucets and a library of hundreds of books. And so he's remembered. And it was only 20 years ago that a local man, Patrick Tom Ward, had the idea to resurrect the Irish Railroad Workers' houses, which are now the Irish Railroad Workers Museum. And it's been so successful that they've actually bought the whole block on Lemon Street and renovated them as if Irish families, the Feeney family, were still living there. And so I would encourage any of your listeners who are in the Baltimore area who can get here to go to the museum and see it. It's great history. If you have kids or you're interested in railroads, directly across the street is the B&O Railroad Museum. And you can go there and the kids can climb on trains, and it's a wonderful historical experience. And so, so what happened is the area was that the company, and then at the end of 1876, said that people are going to have to start taking pay cuts. and they cut everybody's pay 10%. And this was a huge challenge for the families. And it was, if you're at the Irish Railroad Workers Museum, you'll see St. Peter the Apostle, which was the neighborhood church for the Irish community. And there were, charities run out of there, alms and things like that for families, because the Irish families tended to be large. You will see, for example, on Lemon Street, the houses are 2.5 stories. And the first 2 stories are for the family. And then the third story was a bedroom area that could be rented to single guys who had just come over. And the idea was that the pattern of the Irish life was to stay for a while, but you marry the first Colleen in the neighborhood, and then you get your own house and have your own kids. But it was not unusual. So the company announced a second cut to be effective in July of 1877. And they published a little notice saying that after their board meeting on the 11th, and John Garrett put out a posted notice saying, "We assume everyone will cheerfully concur with this pay cut." And even though the stockholders were still getting 10% dividends. So it was a clear, it's a story from 2026, where the large parts of the corporation are keeping all the money and screwing the workers.
Mhm.
And in this case, then the workers heard this. And when they went in on July 16th to Camden Yards to collect their pay money, they found that the 10% had been deducted. And so they immediately went on strike. And obviously, there was a lot of talk and a lot of planning for it. But the engineers, the firemen, and the brakemen immediately left the trains. And it's real important to understand that the fireman at that time was a skilled job, because the firemen would load coal. And this was, we have another time, we'll talk about the history of railroads going from wood burning to coal burning. And one of the whole issues for the Irish over many years and about labor in Baltimore was a change from iron rails to steel rails. And the whole tariff battles, because Britain wanted to provide rails for the United States and paid politicians to let them come in, and all this. It's an epic history, is what I say. And it goes off in so many different directions. And so the firemen had to keep the engines, the boiler stoked at exactly the right rate. Because if you didn't keep them fired up enough, the engine would stall. If you fired them up too much, it would explode. And so it was a skilled labor, and they were in there. So they walked off the jobs. A couple of the engineers decided they would try and do it. The company had tried to hire some scabs, but they wouldn't let them on the train. Now, as I said then, the first train that went out, about 30 or 40 people on it, several trains to Relay, and they stopped down there. There was a train to Locust Point, which was the harbor, and it was a feeder line that was broken because Baltimore had become a major harbor at that time. And one of the things we're going to see during the strike is that the pressure on the government was put by shipping companies who had uh, goods in the harbor that needed to be unloaded and shipped, and they couldn't. And in some cases, people were bringing in commodities from southern Maryland, agricultural stuff that was going to rot and go bad if it couldn't be shipped immediately. So it was a huge issue. And one of the things which we find throughout the strike is how supportive the communities were, the families, the churches, the other workers, to helping the strikers be successful. So we'll see then, for example, the, uh, John Garrett, the head of the B&O, tried to send Baltimore City Police out to Relay, which is in Howard County. It's an adjacent county. And the sheriff and everything down there and the judge down there said, "No, you can't do it. You're out of your jurisdiction." So anyhow, they all assemble at Camden Yards, what was in Camden Junction, and the building which we know as the entrance to the baseball park was already built, and it's an incredibly beautiful building. And attached to it is a later, which is a was a warehouse, it's now an office structure. But if you come up in there, you'll see what it is. So the key then is that the strike goes on. One of the most important parts of the strike is it spreads down the line, and the workers were able to seize control of telegraph lines. And a great story is how people communicated during the strike. So they didn't have cell phones exactly, and so they would transfer down the line from one location to another. But the news of the strike spread quickly all across the B&O lines and then eventually out as far as the West Coast. But one of the major events was in Martinsburg, West Virginia. And one of the problems often is that some strike books, many strike books, will claim that the strike started in Martinsburg, West Virginia. And so I'm regularly responding to people saying, no, it didn't start in Martinsburg. It started right here in Baltimore at Camden Yards. And and you will see, and I sent you the historical marker. About 10 years ago, we were able to get the state of Maryland to post a historical marker to commemorate the strike. And it's still there, and it's right on the light rail line. So it's visible to a lot of people as they go through.
And that's an important thing to mention because a lot of our listeners go to Camden Yards quite frequently. They'll try to catch a
Okay.
ball game there. And when you're there, there's a lot to see. Like you mentioned, the Irish Railroad Workers Museum, the B&O Railroad Museum, there's the Babe Ruth Birthplace and Museum, but there is also
Yep.
this plaque that commemorates the 1877 railroad strike in Baltimore that is right by the stadium. So while you're there,
Yep.
just take a few moments
Pay
to
tribute.
really
Pay tribute.
salute these men who fought for Irish immigrants, Irish
Yep.
Americans, and other working people who
Yep.
were new to the country or were trying to settle themselves, and that's very, very important. I want to get back to something you said a little bit ago, where you talk about the fact that the man who owned the railroad, his house was preserved as a museum. And as we celebrate the 250th anniversary of the United States, or as we commemorate it anyway, we notice that the presidents, the generals, the pillars of business,
Slave
they
owners.
slave owners, they have gotten their due. They've gotten their respect.
Yep.
As we look at the people who really built the country, and then we are talking about the slaves, and we're talking about the Irish immigrants who built the railroads, the
Yep. Yep.
Chinese immigrants who built the railroads out west. It's good to remember that it's not just those famous people who played an impact. Yes, they had their impact, but they have been rewarded tenfold for it. It's the people who, the strike of 1877 leads to better pay, better working conditions. It then leads to the weekend and it leads
Yep.
to 8-hour workdays. So, what they were doing has gradually progressed and helped all of us, and nobody seems to remember them. So that's why it is so important to commemorate their lives.
Well, let me give a little commercial here for your audience. We started a Maryland labor history project, Maryland 250, and you can go online, look at maryland250laborhistory.org. And we've got all kinds of material on there about labor history in Maryland. and we're trying to get every state to do it. We're not seeing much effort and energy, but it's a question of remembering what was done here, exactly as you said. And one of the issues that I have is an article about unionism. That's basically my background. But the unions, one thing that they brought us was the one income family. And we have been beaten back. In the 1950s, we were about 37% of the workforce, and another 40% got union conditions. Now we're 5% in the private sector. And so there is no more one income family, except if you're Jeff Bezos or Elon Musk. And now it's become two incomes is not enough for many people. So this whole revival of labor history is something which I think is so important. And I think it was so important, for example, in the state of Maryland to try and get this historical marker put up. Because for your fans of Irish history, there was only one other one at the time, and that's down in Adelphi, Maryland. And it was where Mother Jones lived. And when she died, she was 100 years old, a great Irish woman, uh, revolutionary hero, died. And so there is a marker down there to commemorate her. How history is remembered is a guide for tomorrow, because what you mentioned, and so eliminating labor history, eliminating things, memories of the strike, are a way of discouraging young people from even thinking about collective action.
You mentioned Mother Jones, and actually, earlier in this project of covering the 250 years of Irish immigrant and Irish American history in the United States, I talked to a college professor who wrote a book about Mother Jones and how she led a strike of kids who were being forced into the
Yeah,
factories, and these kids were just trying to
yep,
get the right to go to school a couple of days a week. And, we look at it
yeah,
now and we think,
yes,
oh my goodness, kids who wanted to go to school. But that was what she was trying to accomplish. And, those are
yeah.
the type of people that we are trying to highlight, as well as, some of the people who were involved in military actions and things like that. I do want to get to something that you mentioned about how this history relates to the modern day. When I talked to that professor about Mother Jones, I brought up the fact that our workforce looks a lot different nowadays, right? And you mentioned how few people are in unions now, how the one income family is basically a thing of the past unless you're fairly wealthy. But we've also moved away from jobs like laying railroad and being a fireman on the
Yeah.
railroad. And we have turned into much more of a service economy. Is there a way to translate what happened in 1877 and the workers and labor movement and take it away from industrial jobs like the ones that we had in the 19th and early 20th century and relate it to the new look of the economy here in the 21st
Well,
century?
I think one of the things which is really important, as I said, I'll send you the article that I had published a couple of weeks ago on the decline of unions. And one of it is the failure to organize. And we have been systematically pushed out. And we are facing, and people in offices now are face artificial intelligence. We have just no idea what that's going to do. And I think we all have seen it if you get robocalls and things like that, even for stuff like prescriptions that are your individual material. Every one of those is a job replaced. You go through a turnpike toll booth on with an easy pass. There used to be someone there to take your money and was being paid and had health insurance and stuff like that. And it's a dramatically changing world. Having a union is the way you have some control over that. You talk about child labor. There's some states in the South that have abolished any restrictions on child labor. So middle school students can come and have to work all night or will work all night. And then they get supposed to go to school the next day. This is not the way people should live, and it's certainly not the way they're going to be successful. So it's a endless kind of a topic. And I think you look at how the strikers dealt with it and their communities dealt with it. Because, for example, to get back to the historical, we talked about Martinsburg, West Virginia. And one of the things which happened was the governor of West Virginia, as well as the head of the B&O and the governor of Maryland, immediately demanded that federal troops be brought in. Governor of West Virginia sent in two brigades of state militia to Martinsburg to try and break the strike on the first day. And the militia got there and they found that they had relatives among the strikers and they ended up fraternizing with the strikers. The whole thing totally collapsed and the militia became part of the strike. The same thing happened in Baltimore, where the militia was here. There was an episode in the late Friday of the strike where two militia companies were being sent from Baltimore out to Western Maryland, because what the governors decided was that they could send militia to an area which they were not from, and they would get the response that they wanted, the military response. And what happened is that a group of militia, the Sixth Company was over by the shot tower in East Baltimore, and we're going to march across the harbor. One of the things that happened, and it's a little similar to what you see today, is that there were no railroad tracks between Camden Yards and the east part of Baltimore where the line ran up to Philadelphia, because people in the harbor in those residential areas said that trains would make too much noise. And so there were tracks, but the trains that were moving along the harbor were pulled by horses, so they were quiet. So this group of militia starts marching. Their streets are being repaid. A group of people gather, and again, you will see the vocabulary. I just referred to a group of people. The Baltimore Sun called them a uncontrollable mob, and they started throwing rocks at the militia people to try and discourage them from coming. And right by Baltimore City Hall, for no reason, militia opened fire. And again, this is exactly like what we saw yesterday in Minneapolis. And 10 people were killed, none of whom had anything to do with the strike. One of them was a 10-year-old boy who was selling newspapers to support his mother. Another one was a brother of one of the militia people who got up on a light pole to see if he could see his brother. And it just said to someone down below, "Mo, let's get out of here." And he got shot through the neck. And if you go in the book, you'll see the incredible stories of families going to the hospitals and stuff like that. I don't know if you've had a chance to read it all the way through. And so they then marched over to Camden Yards. They were then blocked by families, by women who stopped them from going, to actually set the offices of the B&O on fire down by Camden Yards. The next step then was the contact of the President of the United States. And the president at this time was Rutherford B. Hayes, and he was elected, if you remember your American history, not by the voters, but as a kind of a compromise. And one of the things that he did to gain the Southern votes was to promise that no federal troops would ever be sent into a state. And so what happens is he then immediately sends federal troops into Baltimore, puts us under military law. And one of the things that I always use as a kind of a joke when I do these programs on the strike is that a battalion of federal workers is sent from Fort McHenry, and they are led by Commander William Barry. And so there are two great William Barrys in this story.
Well, I think that's a very interesting point when you talk about the connections between working class people, when you talk about the Irish Americans in the Northeast and the Mid Atlantic, and how Rutherford B. Hayes was Rutherford B. Hayes was basically only in office because he agreed to end Reconstruction. So
No, that's right. Yeah.
Rutherford B. Hayes is now in charge of the federal government, and working people are trying to get things from him, but he's obviously going to side with the wealthier class because that's who
Yeah.
got him into office. He wouldn't be in office if it wasn't for that. And you can see the connection now between the former slaves who are just in their first generation of being free and how they're being used now against Irish Americans and Irish immigrants, where they're
Yep.
trying to pit working people against each other. And I think that is a great symbol. I want people to pick up the book, The 1877 Railroad Strike in Baltimore, and we are running out of time here. So why don't you tell people how they can get this book? And we're going to have you on the show again later to talk about the actual Irish immigrants and Irish Americans who laid the track for the B&O Railroad.
Well, I would say one thing in terms of Irish history that right before the beginning of the strike was the Day of the Rope. And that was where 10 Irish miners were hung up in Pennsylvania for membership in the alleged membership in the Molly Maguires. And so this thing is spreading, this anti-Irish movement is spreading across the country. You can get the best place to get the book is to go to the Irish Family Museum. And it used to be called the Irish Railroad Workers Museum, and they've changed it so it's now the Irish Family Museum. And you could get it there. I'm embarrassed to say you can also order it off of Amazon. My whole attitude to that has really changed. And it was published, self-published through Amazon when I first did it because I couldn't find anybody else who wanted to do it. But I would be glad to have any contacts from people and comments on the book or comments on the history. We do walking tours from the Irish. We have done. If you look at the picture, in 2017 we had 140th anniversary of the strike, and so we had a lot of people here. And we started at the marker at Camden Yards. We then walked to the B&O Museum so they could see what the engines and what the and the B&O Museum still has a workshop in the back, which was where Irish workers lived and the Feeney family who owned the house. And then we went to the Irish Railroad Workers Museum. So it was incredible history. And we also had a whole panel on current railroad issues today, because in some ways they haven't changed. You're looking at proposals now to have engineers with no engineers.
Bill Barry, thank you so much for being here.
Thank you, Rick, for having me. It's been great.